In Texas, a raging fire turns a couple's home into a death chamber. Investigators believe it's arson, but they'll need an expert to sniff out the truth. After a student in Illinois disappears, police fear that she's the victim of a murder. The crime scene may have gone cold, but at least one tracker is still hot on the trail. Detectives in Tennessee suspect that a missing persons case has turned into a homicide. To make their case, they must rely on canine detectives to dig up the truth. When plotting a murder, a clever killer will do anything to cover his tracks. But not all clues can be concealed. When investigators lose sight of their prey, it falls upon a special breed of dog to pick up the scent of the kill. On June 8, 1994, around 3:15 a.m., a pizza delivery man in the rural community of Belleville, Texas, was on his way home after working the late shift. He spotted a man pulling out of the driveway of a burning house. The driver flagged down the delivery man. He identified himself as Charles Fitz. Fitz said his wife was trapped inside their burning home. He begged the delivery driver to call 911. By the time the fire department arrived, intense flames and heat consumed the home. As long as the fire burned out of control, firefighters could only battle the blaze from the outside. Inside, chances for Francis Fitz's survival vanished with the rest of the couple's home. Emergency medical technicians arrived to treat Charles Fitz. Disoriented and upset, he blamed the fire on the cheap wiring that ran through their home. With difficulty breathing, Fitz was transported to the hospital for treatment of smoke inhalation. By the time the flames were extinguished, some 3 hours later, the house was reduced to a smoldering pile of rubble. Somewhere inside was the body of Francis Fitz. Detectives began their routine investigation into the cause and origin of the deadly fire. They started with a visit to Charles Fitz, who was recovering in the hospital. Fitz told them that he'd fallen asleep that night on the sofa. In the early morning hours, he woke up to a house filled with smoke. He tried to get to the bedroom to save Frances, his wife of 17 years. But the smoke and flames were too intense. He'd tried repeatedly to get back into the house, breaking several windows in the process. But all of his rescue attempts failed. It was a harrowing account. But to investigators at the Austin County Sheriff's Department, the story was at odds with Fitz's physical condition. Sheriff's Deputy Richard Holloman explains.
According to what he was telling us, there should have been, some burn marks on his arms, his face, and should have singed hair, but of which he had none.
The next morning, investigators proceeded to the fire scene. Francis Fitz was found in what used to be the couple's bedroom. Her charred remains were transported to the morgue. The medical examiner would later confirm that the cause of death was smoke inhalation. Investigators began processing the burned-out wreckage. Looking to confirm Fitz's story, they searched for signs of faulty wiring. But there was no evidence of an electrical source to the fire. Neither the gas main nor the water heater had malfunctioned. With the obvious accidental causes ruled out, there remained one possibility. The fire had been intentionally set. Investigators began looking for signs of arson. During their search, investigators found debris with alligator-like patterns on the surface. Wood rarely burns this way unless it is doused with an accelerant, like gasoline or lighter fluid. Finding traces of the fluid would be the first step in proving arson. It appeared, however, that the fire had burned away that evidence. But investigators had another tool in their arsenal. Canines can be trained to sniff out traces of arson that otherwise go undetected by humans. George Cavett of the Houston Police Department teaches dogs to search for flammable liquids called hydrocarbons.
It can be naphtha, alcohol, distilled liquor, brake fluid, anything of that nature. Coleman fuel, charcoal lighter fluid, just a large list of things that puts off the same scent that the dogs can detect. Okay, good girl, we got that. Good girl, let's check.
The dogs began searching through the remains of Fitz's house.
Back here, fetch it up for me.
Hours of searching passed with no signs of a hit. But then they found something. And the location was just inches from where Francis Fitz's body was discovered.
Good girl. And he worked all areas of the bedroom and came back right to the flooring that the victim was laying on top of and gave me an alert, and right beside of it and on the bed springs and that whole segment.
The samples were placed in sealed cans to preserve whatever vapors remained and sent to the lab. With their suspicions raised, investigators next took the dogs to the police impound lot, where Charles Fitz's truck had been towed. The dogs were given the command to search for traces of accelerant. Again, the dogs alerted police to the presence of hydrocarbons on the gas and brake pedals. They were collected along with the other samples and sent to the lab for analysis. With the help of their canine detectives, investigators had recovered enough evidence for forensic examiners to conduct a thorough analysis.
All right, good girl.
At the lab, a piece of charcoal is inserted into each paint can containing the evidence removed from the scene. Then, the can is heated to just below the boiling point for up to 18 hours. During that time, the charcoal absorbs any hydrocarbon vapors. Any potential hydrocarbon is then removed from the charcoal with the solvent carbon disulfide. The resulting liquid is then analyzed by means of a gas chromatograph. By breaking down the substance into its various components, the gas chromatograph produces a pattern of peaks and valleys. In this case, the known pattern for gasoline came up in 3 of the 13 samples. The 2 from the interior of Charles Fitz's truck and 1 from the bedroom where the body was found. Thanks to the accelerant-sniffing dogs, the deadly blaze had been exposed as a deliberate act of arson and a homicide. And Charles Fitz, the only other person in the house, was the most likely suspect in his wife's death. Police in Belleville, Texas, investigating the death of Francis Fitz, killed in a house fire, believed they had uncovered a murder. Since he was the only other person in the house, Francis's husband Charles was the prime suspect. Travis Kane, the district attorney of Austin County, began delving into Charles Fitz's background.
The family of Francis Fitz told us that Charles Fitz was a braggart person who really never held a job. He was somebody who wore flashy jewelry, somebody who wore big hats and big boots, who bragged a lot and made a lot of noise about what he was going to do, but never really did anything.
Through family members, police learned that Frances, a secretary, was the breadwinner of the family, even though she struggled with debilitating arthritis.
I thought I just fixed some spaghetti.
She was dedicated to taking care of Charles and never spoke poorly of him. Though Charles rarely gave anything of himself in return, the marriage seemed solid to outside observers. Having found no obvious marital problems, police struggled to find a motive for the deadly fire. Perhaps in one of Charles's many unsuccessful business ventures, he had made enemies. Someone seeking revenge against him could have set the fire. Detectives decided to take a closer look at some of his former associates. As investigators continued looking for answers, Francis's relatives sifted through the wreckage, looking for any mementos of their lost loved one. During their search, they found some documents that had survived the fire. Among the papers found was a list of overseas phone numbers and several insurance policies on Francis, listing Charles as the beneficiary. Investigators immediately contacted the insurance agent. They learned that Charles Fitz had recently made changes to the policies. In the months before the fire, he had upped the amount of the insurance on Francis's life and on the home. The agent told investigators that Charles Fitz stood to gain $824,000 from the deadly fire. Though the timing of the policy changes was suspicious, it wasn't proof of murder. And investigators still had to rule out the possibility that someone other than Charles Fitz had committed the crime. But all of Charles's past business associates had been dismissed as potential suspects. Now, investigators had to determine why Charles Fitz would want his dedicated and supportive wife dead. For answers, they turned to the only other piece of evidence that survived the fire. One of the overseas phone numbers led investigators to a young Englishwoman named Tracy Munns, who was living in the Philippines. Tracy reluctantly told investigators that she had had an affair with Charles Fitz while she attended college in Texas. She claimed that they planned to marry after she graduated. Charles had agreed to leave his wife. But Tracy grew frustrated when Charles didn't keep up his end of the bargain. She moved to the Philippines and tried to cut ties. Charles wouldn't let it go.
Then in June of '94, he called her and said, "My wife is gone. I'm free to come down to you." And she said, "No, I don't want to have anything to do with you." And that was the last time she spoke to Charles Fitz.
By killing his wife, investigators believed that Charles Fitz was clearing the way to be with his mistress.
tell you what,
The insurance payoff would give him enough money to start a new life overseas. Though Tracy Munns had provided investigators with a possible motive, they needed to find proof that Fitz had planned his wife's murder. Poring over the suspect's financial records, investigators learned that Charles Fitz had sold his second car, a Mercedes, shortly after the fire. Though it didn't seem like much of a clue, they tracked down the classified ad and the man who bought the car. To investigators, the language of the ad was telling. It read, 1983 Mercedes, must sell, leaving country. The man who bought the car said that during the sale, Fitz told him that he was unmarried. The ad and the information from the car buyer, in addition to the arson uncovered by the accelerant-sniffing dogs, was enough for investigators to arrest Charles Fitz for murder. Detectives theorized that Charles Fitz believed he had everything to gain from torching his house and killing his wife. Not only would it give him a huge amount of money, it would clear the way for him to be with his young lover. But he would be disappointed. 1 week after the fire, Fitz proposed to Tracy, only to find that she'd already married someone else. On February 2nd, 1996, Charles Fitz was found guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. By picking up the scent of arson, dogs in Texas brought a killer to justice. But in the Midwest, police couldn't prove a murder had been committed until they got some help finding the victim. On March 5th, 1987, a distraught father contacted the Champaign, Illinois Police Department. Ludwig Warner believed his 22-year-old daughter Karen was missing. It was a Thursday, and he hadn't seen her or her car since Monday morning. Her purse, wallet, and eyeglasses were also gone. His daughter frequently spent the night at friends' homes, but she'd never been gone for this long without checking in. The next day, detectives questioned Karen Warner's friends. Like the young woman's father, none of them had seen her in 4 days. One close friend told investigators that over the last week she hadn't noticed anything unusual about Karen's behavior. Though Karen had recently lost her job, she was looking forward to resuming her college career in the fall. Karen hadn't mentioned any plans to travel. But that didn't mean that she hadn't taken an unexpected trip. In fact, Karen had recently been getting calls from an ex-boyfriend named Curly B. Lee. He wanted to rekindle the romance, but Karen was planning to tell him in person that she wasn't interested. Curly had become too possessive and physically abusive. But it was possible that Karen had a change of heart. During their time as a couple, Karen and Curly frequently took unplanned vacations. Investigators at the Champaign Police Department believed there was a reasonable explanation for Karen's disappearance. Sergeant Jim Luking explains.
She was gone, he was gone, and her car was gone. It could very well have been that they decided to go off together, which wouldn't be all that unusual for two people to decide to do that.
To find out, investigators paid a visit to Curly Lee. When they were led into his rooming house, they found that Curly and his clothes were gone. and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But Karen's family didn't buy it. Desperate for answers, they urged the media to get involved. Hoping to generate a lead, pictures of Karen, her car, and of Curly were published in the area newspapers, along with details of her disappearance.
His name is Curly B. Lee.
No one responded about Karen, but someone had seen Curly. The caller reported that a friend of hers had driven Curly to the bus station 2 days after Karen's disappearance. Curly said he was heading south to his mother's house in Hughes, Arkansas. Champaign police contacted law enforcement in Arkansas and asked them to speak with Curly. Like the rest of Karen's friends, Curly said that he had no idea where his ex-girlfriend could be. He said they had spoken briefly before he left Champaign, but that was just to say goodbye. As investigators struggled to find answers, the family's publicity campaign paid off. A man in Danville, Illinois, 30 miles from Champaign, recognized the photograph of Karen's car. He believed that same car was sitting abandoned in his church parking lot. A check of the license plates confirmed that it was the vehicle registered to the missing woman. If any questions remained about Karen Warner's fate, the discovery of her abandoned car erased them.
That was the first physical evidence that there was something wrong. It would be unusual for her to be there, for her car to be there especially.
Investigators brought the car to the police station for a more detailed forensic examination. But the initial search of the vehicle indicated no obvious signs of a struggle. The car was thoroughly dusted for prints. Technicians collected blue and red fibers found on the floor mats and in the trunk. The items were forwarded to the crime lab for further analysis. Hoping someone had seen how the car ended up in Danville, police turned again to the public for help. And again, the strategy paid off. A woman called police to tell them that she may have seen the car. Police brought her in to identify the vehicle.
I was driving.
The woman's name was Rhonda, and like Karen, she too was an ex-girlfriend of Curly Lee's. She recognized the car immediately. Police questioned her further. Rhonda admitted that she had driven the car around the time Karen had been reported missing. But she had no idea that the car belonged to Karen Warner. She told investigators that Curly had called her one night asking for a favor.
He said he was going to return the car to a friend.
He needed to return a car to a friend in Danville and asked her to drive him because he didn't have a license.
You know what was in the bag?
Did he get it in?
To Detective Mike Smith, Curly's demeanor sounded suspicious.
What we're trying to do, and a plate is missing. She asked him whose car it was, and he never replied. He never answered. And he told her to avoid certain streets and to drive fast.
Rhonda said that Curly then dropped her off at a bar in Danville. She remembered that he had a grocery bag with him in the car, but she never saw what it contained. Curly explained that he had a few errands to run and told her to wait for him in the bar. He gave Rhonda some money for a drink, then drove away. About 15 minutes later, Curly returned to the bar on foot.
He said that he didn't have a valid
Later
driver's
that night,
license.
he had some friends drive them back to Champaign. Rhonda hadn't heard from Curly since.
No.
Investigators suspected that in the 15 minutes that Curly had left Rhonda alone, he would have had time to dispose of Karen's body, which was likely hidden in the trunk. They believed he then abandoned the car in the church parking lot, located just a few blocks away, and then returned to the bar on foot. They now focused their attention to finding Karen Warner's body, and they believed it was in the wooded area behind the bar.
He was only gone long enough that he couldn't have gone very far to place the body anywhere else, so it had to be down there, in our opinion, it had to be down there in the weeds or in the brush or in the river.
But finding a body in this densely wooded area would be difficult. There were no obvious grave sites. And in the cold air, any smell of decomposition had been hampered. After 2 days of searching, the team had reached their limits. But investigators had one more option. They called upon the expertise of Joyce Fairs, a dog handler from nearby Urbana, Illinois. For over 15 years, Fairs and her dogs have volunteered their services to local police and sheriff's departments. Bloodhounds like hers are bred to distinguish the vaguest of scents. The handler has to begin with a scent article. It can be any object the victim has come in contact with. In this case, investigators got a t-shirt and a pillowcase from Karen Warner's bedroom and sealed them in a plastic bag to preserve the scent. Fairs then gave the dog the find command, letting him know his job is to find the source of that same smell.
Check it out.
The bloodhound took Fairs on a twisted route. 3 times he brought her down close to the river, as if someone had carried Karen's body, looking for a place to hide her, then deciding against it. Then the dog led Fairs to a deep ravine. But it would have been difficult for anyone to cross this gorge carrying a body. Investigators knew that the body had to be near. Within 15 minutes, the dog closed in on an area of brush. At first, Joyce thought he'd lost the scent, but then, in a slight depression covered with brush, she caught a glimpse of a red sweater and a human hand. Investigators in Champaign, Illinois struggled to solve the disappearance of 22-year-old Karen Warner. Hidden in a remote wooded area, Joyce Fairs and her bloodhound believed they had finally found her.
And then I could see her hand, the back of her right hand. And that's when I shouted for Jim Looking to come. I believed that we'd found her body.
After removing the body, investigators began scouring the area for clues. Nearby, investigators recovered a blue blanket. 100 yards from where the body was found, they discovered a grocery bag like the one Rhonda described. Inside, investigators found shoes, eyeglasses, and a purse. All of the items were collected and sent on to the crime lab.
Okay, hold those for me. Just
Joyce Fairs and her dog had uncovered a homicide, and investigators had little doubt that they had found Karen Warner. Using dental records, the medical examiner confirmed that the remains were those of Karen Warner. And a fracture to one of the bones in her throat told him that the young woman had been strangled to death. The lack of defensive wounds and other injuries suggested that Karen had been caught off guard. Now, investigators had to make a murder case. And Karen's ex-boyfriend, Curly B. Lee, was their prime suspect. They turned to the crime lab for help. Examiners confirmed that blue fibers recovered from the victim's clothes matched the fibers from the blue blanket found near the body. Next, the blue fibers from the crime scene and red fibers taken from Karen's sweater were compared against the blue and red fibers found in the trunk of Karen's car. All of the fibers matched. Examiners had proven that Karen Warner had been wrapped in a blanket and then placed in the trunk of her car. And the last person known to have driven the vehicle was Curly B. Lee. Illinois police now had enough evidence to arrest him for murder. But as they headed south to Arkansas to pick him up, they learned from authorities that Curly had fled again. But this time, police quickly tracked him down. By canvassing bus stations, Arkansas police learned that Curly had just purchased a ticket to Palm Beach, Florida. Investigators contacted law enforcement in Palm Beach. They staked out the bus station, waiting for the unsuspecting fugitive to arrive. Curly was arrested and extradited to Illinois. Back in Champaign, investigators confronted Curly with the case they'd built against him. He admitted killing Karen, but claimed it was an accident. All of the evidence suggested otherwise. Police theorized that Curly had tried to rekindle his romance with Karen. But when Karen refused his advances, he erupted into a rage.
He didn't like to lose anything, and he decided that he was going to teach her a lesson. Now, whether he intended to kill her or accidentally killed her, I don't know, but I think if you strangle somebody, you intend to kill them.
After killing her, Curly struggled to come up with a plan to cover up his crime. He collected Karen's belongings in a grocery bag and then searched for a blanket to wrap the body in before carrying her out to the trunk. Later that night, after dropping Rhonda off at the bar, he drove behind the property and searched for a place to get rid of his victim. In an effort to make it appear that Karen had simply taken off, he drove her car to a nearby church and abandoned it. 2 days later, he packed up his belongings and fled to Arkansas. But with Joyce Fares and her bloodhound on his trail, Curly's run quickly came to an end. Curly B. Lee was convicted of murder and concealment of a homicide. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison. In the Karen Warner case, the dog had to follow a trail that was 7 days old. To solve a murder in Tennessee, another canine will have to track a scent buried for almost a year. In June of 1996, Ray and Fleeta Holliday went to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation for help in finding their 39-year-old daughter, Kathy Beadle.
So tell me what you found out.
In April, they said, they received a letter from her saying that she discovered she had cancer and was headed to a clinic in Toronto for experimental treatment. She said that she didn't want any direct contact with them during the therapy. From then on, Kathy communicated only by fax. The typed messages were brief and impersonal, completely out of character for their daughter. Fearing that Kathy might be going through some kind of emotional breakdown, Ray went to Toronto to find his daughter. He got the address off a Father's Day card Kathy had sent the month before. As he approached the front of the treatment center, a panic set in. The address belonged to a run-down and abandoned building. There was no cancer treatment center and no clue to his daughter's whereabouts. Fleeta Holliday added that just before her daughter disappeared, Kathy was considering leaving her husband, Tony Vick. But Kathy had 2 children from a previous marriage to think about. Her first husband had died tragically in a plane crash. As part of the insurance settlement, Kathy received $8,000 a month.
From your daughter, not from your daughter.
Though she had become wealthy as a result, she wanted her kids to have a father figure. But Kathy seemed to have fallen out of love with Tony. And though he made every attempt to get back in her good graces, Kathy didn't want to talk to him. She told her mother that she might need some time to herself in the near future to sort things out.
And the address?
With no evidence suggesting a crime had taken place, investigators at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation believed that Kathy had simply kept her word. But Kathy's parents knew their daughter would not leave her 2 kids behind and disappear without a trace. Desperate for answers, they mounted their own publicity campaign, plastering Kathy's picture all over Tennessee. But the family never heard a word. In February of 1997, nearly a year since Kathy had disappeared, Ray and Fleeta Holliday made one last attempt to get the police involved. They contacted the Knox County Sheriff's Office. They told investigators that a few months back, Kathy's husband, Tony Vick, had also disappeared, claiming he was going to find his wife. He left the children and the couple's home with the Hollidays. They hadn't heard from Tony since. The resulting financial strain forced Ray and Fleeta to sell their daughter's home. But before they did, they wanted to be absolutely sure that there weren't any overlooked clues in the home. Sheriff Tim Hutchinson took the case.
Once we learned that all the events that had occurred prior to us being notified that, number one, she was missing from our jurisdiction, and second, it had been a long period of time. That's hard to follow up and start an investigation when that much time has lapsed. Investigators processed the empty home, searching for any clues that could help them determine Kathy Beadle's fate. But since the home had been placed on the market, a vast amount of potential evidence had been destroyed. Furniture and belongings had been removed. Floors had been scrubbed. Walls had been painted. For investigator Terry Lee of the Knox County Sheriff's Office, working a cleaned crime scene means looking past the obvious.
For instance, in this situation, the carpet had been vacuumed. That's taken up good forensic evidence such as hair, fiber samples, and so forth that we would normally collect. So you have to look a little bit deeper.
Investigators scrutinized every inch of the home. They processed all of the sink drains in the home using luminol, a chemical that glows in the presence of blood. traces of blood were found in 3 separate sink traps. The traps were removed and sent to the crime lab. Investigators determined that the blood found in the sink was human. But the samples were too deteriorated for a more comprehensive analysis. Still, the presence of so much blood led detectives to suspect something violent had happened in the couple's home. Investigators in Tennessee struggled to solve the mysterious disappearance of Kathy Beadle, a 39-year-old mother of 2, missing for over a year. After searching her and her husband's vacant home, investigators believed they had uncovered evidence of foul play. They decided to take a closer look at Kathy's husband, Tony Vick. What they found was not encouraging.
And then we learned that Tony Vick's first wife died suspiciously. Some say she slipped and fell and drowned in a bathtub.
Others said that Tony had murdered her. But instead of being charged, Vick turned a profit, earning life insurance payoffs that totaled over $600,000. Investigators now feared that Kathy Beadle met a similar fate. And they believed money was the motive for murder. But investigators were a long way from making their case. They had no body, and their prime suspect, Tony Vick, had also disappeared. Hoping to generate a lead, details of the case were published in area newspapers. The tactic worked. The owner of a local consignment shop called police. She recognized Tony Vick.
They belong to my wife.
The woman stated that a few months back, a man dropped off a lot of expensive clothing. He seemed glum and told her that his girlfriend had just died of cancer. He told the owner that he would return for the check once the clothes had been sold. He never did. The check, made out to Tony Vick, remained unclaimed. For investigators, Tony's statements to the consignment store owner had a very clear meaning.
That tells us that, she's definitely deceased. We just need to keep digging, need to keep looking until we can find her body.
To build their case against Tony Vick, Knox County sheriffs needed to know his every move prior to his disappearance. Investigators tracked down the nanny who took care of his and Kathy's children. She hadn't observed any violence between Kathy and Tony, nor did she notice any sign of struggle in the home following Kathy's disappearance. But she was able to offer investigators an unusual piece of information. She remembered that after Kathy disappeared, Vick scolded her and the kids for playing in the backyard. Investigators suspected that there was another reason for his outburst. They now believed that Kathy Beadle was buried somewhere in her own backyard. A team of forensic investigators went back to Tony and Kathy's vacant house. Now they were looking for a clandestine grave, one that had been dug a year earlier. But after hours of searching, they could find no evidence of a burial site. Unless investigators could find Kathy's body, making a murder case against Tony Vick would be difficult. And they were running out of ways to accomplish that goal. In Tennessee, investigators from the Knox County Sheriff's Department believed their missing person, Kathy Beadle, had been murdered. And they believed her body had been buried somewhere in her backyard. But hours of exhaustive searching yielded no clues. Investigators had one more option. At Knox County's Canine Unit, dogs are trained to search for a variety of scents, from narcotics to explosives to fugitives. Working with dogs since 1994, Sergeant Robert Spangler has come to appreciate the animal's ability to pick up where the human senses leave off.
Their sense of smell is 200,000 times to 500,000 times what a human is. And that's basically what they're good for. And if there's any kind of scent there, human or non-human, they're going to pick it up where a human can't, even by looking.
But even Sergeant Spangler had doubts as to whether the dog could detect a body after it had been buried for a year. In March of 1997, he and his dog were brought to Vic's backyard, where he gave his partner the command to search for a human scent. As they approached a pile of wood, he noticed the signs of an alert. The dog was telling them to dig beneath the woodpile. Shortly after they began digging, investigators struck a layer of concrete. Knowing that evidence could be anywhere, they carefully sifted through the soil. As they dug further with their hands, trying not to break the concrete, they realized that the dog had discovered a grave. In the concrete, they could see the outline of a body. Once the cement was carefully removed, they could see the body of a woman wrapped in a sleeping bag and a layer of plastic. The body was sent to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. The medical examiner confirmed through dental records that this was the body of Kathy Beadle. Some snapped cartilage in her neck told her that she died from strangulation. Someone had killed her with his bare hands. That someone, investigators believed, was her husband, Tony Vick. The Sheriff's Department finally had the evidence they needed to secure an arrest warrant for Tony Vick. But they still didn't know where he was. His photograph and description were entered into the NCIC, a database that connects law enforcement agencies throughout the country. A few days later, Knox County sheriffs received a call. Tony Vick was apprehended for stealing a $100 suit from a store outside of Atlantic City, New Jersey. When police there ran his name through their database, they learned that he was wanted for much more than shoplifting. Detectives theorized that soon after the death of his first wife, Vick had his eye on Kathy, not for her love or companionship, but strictly for her money. The man Kathy came to trust and love soon began plotting her murder. A year before Kathy disappeared, Tony gave Ray and Fleeta Holliday a fax machine. He knew that in order to collect the $8,000 a month Kathy received from her first husband's death, it would need to appear as if she were alive. In April of 1996, after all of the elements of his plan were in place, Tony Vick carried out the murder in the couple's home. After strangling her, he dug a grave, then covered it with concrete, thinking it would conceal his guilt from the world. He then sent faxes to the family in Kathy's name, assuring them that their daughter was alive. But Sergeant Spangler's dog uncovered the truth. Tony Vick was convicted of the first-degree murder of Kathy Beadle and sentenced to life in prison. He was subsequently found guilty of killing his first wife. He received an additional life sentence. When the human senses reach their limit, man's best friend can become a detective's greatest asset. Whether they're used to sniff out arson, track a missing person, or uncover a hidden grave, no rival can beat the dog when it comes to finding the scent of the kill. An elderly woman is pulled from the murky waters of a rural pond in Alabama. A few scraps of evidence are all investigators have to link her to her killer.
We found her.
In Texas, the body of a woman swept away in a flash flood is found downstream. Can forensic scientists wash away deception and find proof of murder? A car crash on a country road in Wisconsin claims a woman's life. Detectives must wade through ambiguous evidence to prove her death was no accident. Once, water could dissolve evidence linking murderers to their crimes. But today, scientists can look beneath the surface for proof of homicide, even when the victims are found dead in the water. Grand Bay, Alabama, May 21st, 1994. Two teenagers boating on a pond, known locally as Blue Hole, noticed something floating in the water. As they approached, they realized it was a human body. They fled the scene and alerted their parents, who called the police. When the Mobile County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene, they recovered the body of an elderly woman. It was clear that this was not an accidental drowning. The victim had a tire jack chained around her waist, and her hands had been removed. As investigators began documenting the scene, detectives contacted the Sheriff's Department for a missing persons check. They hoped a search of NCIC, a database containing descriptions of people reported missing, could help them identify the victim. Sergeant Harold Bolster explains.
All missing person reports or missing persons are placed on the NCIC. And we look for any local matches, anything close to Mobile or Moss Point, Pascagoula, anything in the general region that might match up to what we had.
Only one name fit the description of the victim. 85-year-old Irma Williams had been reported missing the day before in nearby Moss Point, Mississippi. Dispatchers contacted Detective John J. Gaffney, who was investigating that disappearance.
And they advised that the Mobile County Sheriff's Office had discovered a body in Grand Bay, Alabama, which is the next jurisdiction over from us, and that they believed the body was could possibly be my missing person.
Detectives from the Moss Point, Mississippi Police Department were dispatched to the scene. After getting a detailed description of the victim from deputies, the detectives believed they had found Irma Williams. It appeared that their missing persons case was now a homicide. Investigators began searching the surrounding area for any evidence that would help them identify the killer. But a large amount of trash and debris had collected at the pond.
Take a look at this.
Determining what was evidence and what wasn't would be difficult. As investigators scoured the area near the water's edge, they found fresh tire tracks imprinted in the sand.
Zigzag pattern.
Unsure if these tracks had been left by the killer, plaster casts were made. As the search of the area continued, detectives noticed a cigarette butt with a flattened end hidden among some overgrowth. Unlike most of the trash in the area, it didn't appear to have been there very long. It was collected and sent to the lab for further analysis. Though investigators believed that the victim was Irma Williams, they needed a positive identification.
Make sure.
They contacted her relatives. James and Sharon Williams confirmed that the victim was James's grandmother, Irma Williams.
Okay, I know this is hard, but I'm gonna have to ask you a couple questions.
James told the officer he and his wife were very close to Irma.
As far as I know, she
He described her as a vivacious woman who loved life and her family. Though her husband of more than 50 years had recently passed away, his estate had allowed her to remain independent. But James said that his father, Henderson Williams, was not close with Irma. In fact, Sharon added that Henderson hadn't seemed very worried when she told him no one could locate his mother. Sharon said she'd gone to Henderson's house around 11 p.m. the night before and found him burning trash in the yard. When told his mother was missing, Henderson seemed distracted and unconcerned. He was preoccupied by the fire the entire time.
You say she goes for a walk?
Despite Henderson's lack of concern, Sharon and James could not imagine that he was involved in his own mother's murder. The autopsy on Irma Williams was performed by Dr. J.C. Upshaw Downs, the chief medical examiner for the state of Alabama. The official cause of death was listed as severe blunt force trauma to the head. Irma Williams had died well before being placed in the pond. And for Dr. Downs, the manner in which the victim's hands were removed was also telling.
This was a clean cut, obviously a sharp instrument like a knife or a razor had been used. There was no hemorrhage or bleeding into the soft tissues. That told me that these were post-mortem injuries. And from that information, it became apparent that somebody was trying to obscure her identity.
By going to such great lengths to hide the victim's identity, investigators were confident the killer was someone close to her. They went to Irma's residence to search for answers. On a section of vinyl flooring in Irma's kitchen, investigators found reddish-brown stains that appeared to be blood. A plastic bag recovered from underneath the sink also looked blood-stained. Convinced they had found the murder scene, investigators continued searching for evidence of homicide. On the table, they noticed an ashtray full of cigarette butts. The ends of the filters were flattened, just like the one recovered from the crime scene.
Small bag?
I had observed an ashtray that had a lot of cigarette butts in it with a real distinctive bite mark on them. I questioned the family about these cigarette butts, and they advised that it was their father's cigarette butts, that he had a real distinctive way he bit on the filter.
Now, detectives wanted to speak to Irma's son, Henderson Williams. When they arrived at his home, he wasn't there. As they prepared to leave, investigators noticed a woman leaving the trailer on Henderson's property.
Excuse me, ma'am. Can I talk to you for a second?
She identified herself as Brenda Rowell. She rented the trailer from Henderson Williams. Though she stated that she and Henderson were close, she was unaware that Irma had been murdered. Investigators sensed that the news made Brenda uneasy. They asked her to accompany them to the Mobile County Sheriff's Department to answer more questions.
She'll be back in no time. Okay? You know, it's short notice and everything, and
Detectives asked Brenda if she'd seen anything unusual at Henderson's place recently.
Can I ask you a couple questions, okay?
Yeah, just arguing a lot.
She mentioned seeing Henderson washing his car the day before.
There's a lot of fighting going on.
He'd scrubbed it inside and out, even the trunk. Brenda thought it was odd that Henderson would suddenly take such pride in the old car's appearance.
Okay, Brenda, I'm asking you.
Investigators showed her a picture of the tire jack recovered from Irma's body.
Yes.
Brenda was surprised. It looked like hers.
You gave him that jack?
She said she had lent it to Henderson recently, but he had not returned it. Investigators turned their focus toward Henderson's relationship with his mother.
She's a very sweet lady, arguing a lot.
Brenda said that Henderson and Irma had been arguing over money from his father's estate.
No, just needed it.
Irma felt her son was greedy and lazy and decided to cut him out of her will and denied him access to money left to her by his father. Henderson became irate.
Don't worry about this one.
In fact, Brenda admitted that a few weeks back, she and Henderson had a bitter argument.
No, I don't like doing this. I don't want to be.
Henderson wanted her to sign Irma's name on checks he had taken from his mother.
I need you to fill a check.
Brenda was reluctant to do it, but Henderson threatened to evict her from the trailer if she didn't. She felt she had no choice. She forged Irma's name on the checks.
Don't worry about it.
For detectives, a motive for murder was beginning to take shape.
Okay, I'll be right there.
And Henderson Williams was now the prime suspect in the death of his mother. Now, investigators needed to prove it. To corroborate Brenda Rowell's story, detectives contacted the manager of Irma's bank. Not only did she confirm Brenda's account, she said that just before Irma's death, Irma had filed forgery charges against her son. Though the information didn't prove murder, it was enough for investigators to obtain a search warrant for Henderson's property.
I appreciate it.
Police waited until Henderson was away from his residence before executing the warrant. An inspection of Henderson's vehicle revealed the presence of small reddish stains on a rear taillight and larger stains on the trunk's carpet. All of the samples were collected and sent to the state crime lab for further analysis. Investigators also took inked impressions of the car's tires to compare to those recovered at the pond. As the search of Henderson's property continued, investigators located the burn pile described earlier by Sharon Williams. Sifting through the rubble, they found several small bone fragments. Mindful that the victim's hands had been removed and never found, investigators collected the remains. All of the evidence was pointing to Henderson Williams as the killer. But until investigators could physically link him to the murder, he would remain a free man. Police in Alabama and Mississippi struggled to solve the murder of 85-year-old Irma Williams, found floating in a local fishing pond. Though the circumstantial evidence pointed to her son, Henderson Williams, as the killer, investigators had no physical evidence tying him to the murder. Items collected from a search of Henderson's property were sent to the Alabama Department of Forensic Science. Medical examiner Dr. J.C. Upshaw Downs started with bone fragments found in the burn pile.
We were concerned at the time, since her hands had been removed, that those potentially could have been bones from Ms. Williams' hands. So they were examined by our anthropologist and also examined for DNA in order to determine if they were human, and if they were human, were they Ms. Williams. It turned out that they were non-human remains.
Still, examiners had other items recovered from Henderson's property. Serologist Elaine Scott analyzed stains taken from the trunk liner of Henderson's vehicle to determine if they were of human origin. Tetramethylbenzidine, a chemical that reacts to protein in human blood by turning it blue, is applied to the swabs. The initial screening confirmed the stains found in Henderson's trunk were human blood. Scott then repeated the process on the stains found on items from the victim's kitchen. They too were of human origin. Now, examiners needed to determine the source of the blood. DNA testing was performed on all of the samples. After extracting and isolating specific genetic characteristics in each sample, examiners determined the blood found in the victim's kitchen was genetically consistent with the blood found in Henderson's car. When those results were compared to DNA samples taken from Irma Williams at autopsy, the results were indisputable.
The blood stains in this case were at the house and placed the victim bleeding in the house, and also they placed the victim bleeding on the car.
Though the evidence was powerful, it was not ironclad. To make their case, investigators needed to physically link Henderson Williams to the crime scene. And there was one piece of evidence that had to be tested. The cigarette butt found at the pond. With only microscopic traces of saliva to work with, examiners determined there was sufficient DNA in the cigarette butt to perform the analysis. Elaine Scott then compared those results to DNA taken from other cigarette butts known to be Henderson's.
The saliva did give us a DNA profile that matched to Mr. Williams, indicating that he had smoked the cigarette at the crime scene.
The information was enough to arrest Henderson Williams for the murder of his 85-year-old mother.
Step out here, please. Listen to this, officer.
In custody, Henderson maintained his innocence, claiming he hadn't been near the pond in recent days. But all of the forensic evidence suggested otherwise. Investigators had matched the tire tread impression recovered at the scene to a tire on Henderson's car.
These officers, please, will tell you what to do.
Police believe that Henderson Williams' anger raged out of control when his mother cut him off from his father's estate. Investigators believe that Henderson Williams went to his mother's home, where he beat her to death. He then removed her hands, hoping to prevent identification, then placed her body in the pond. In April 1996, Henderson Williams stood trial for the murder of his mother, Irma Williams.
This was right there in front of your house. This was in your car.
He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison.
Mr.
In Alabama, there was no doubt that a woman pulled from a small pond had been murdered. But in Texas, police would have to wade through the evidence to determine whether a woman's death was an accident or murder. In this story, some of the names have been changed. Fort Worth, Texas, May 3rd, 1987. Francis and Jesus de la Rosa were settling in for the evening when they heard screams outside their suburban home.
Somebody out there.
A man, soaking wet and distraught, stumbled inside.
What's going on? My girlfriend. Your girlfriend?
He pleaded for them to call 911.
Call the police.
He said his car had been swept away in a flash flood and his girlfriend was missing. The Fort Worth Fire Department's swift water rescue team received the call. For them, these emergencies were becoming all too familiar. Torrential rains had pounded the Fort Worth area during the previous month, destroying property and worse. According to Fire Captain Richard Ward, many people had lost their lives while attempting to drive through flash floods.
The people are on their way to wherever, and they decide to try to cross the water or cross the road where the water's going, and they get swept downstream because just looking at it, they can't tell how deep the water is, and they always underestimate how powerful the water is.
This night, 2 people had made that mistake, and now one of them was missing. The rescue team searched the area near the bridge crossing where the car had been swept away. Divers scoured below the creek surface for any signs of the missing woman or the vehicle. But after several hours of exhaustive searching, rescuers found nothing. As the search continued, police questioned the driver, 40-year-old Domingo Turo, a Cuban immigrant who spoke broken English. Turo told police he had tried to drive through the water on the road. Detective Mike Garvin reviewed Turo's statement.
He didn't realize how swift the water was. He tried to back up, and it was too late. It started washing him off into the creek, and that he tried to get out and was in fact able to, he and the victim both, to get out of the car.
Turo told police that he grabbed his girlfriend, 20-year-old Janice Walters, as the car filled with water and went tumbling downstream in the currents. But the raging water broke his grasp and she was lost. As the floodwaters began to recede several hours later, searchers were finally able to locate Turo's car. It was carried more than a mile from the crossing before being washed up on an embankment. Police retrieved the vehicle, but there was no sign of Janice Walters.
We performed a search around the vehicle, thinking that she might have stayed close to the vehicle whenever it was swept off the roadway. Our search around the vehicle and in the vehicle didn't turn up anything.
Rescuers continued looking for her, but with each passing hour, hopes of finding her unharmed grew dimmer. The search continued into the following day. Around noon, searchers discovered a body washed up on the shoreline. The woman matched Janice's description. The lifeless body, nude except for a small chain necklace, was found 1.5 miles from the spot where the vehicle had been swept away. It seemed that the violent Texas storms had claimed another life. Rescue workers in Fort Worth, Texas, believed that they had recovered the body of 20-year-old Janice Walters, killed when the car she and her boyfriend, Domingo Turo, were driving, got swept away in a flash flood. Authorities contacted Turo and Janice's sister, Kelly Hill, and asked them to identify the body. Kelly confirmed that her sister had been found. Investigators noticed that she seemed distant and cold toward Domingo Turo. In a statement taken later that day, Kelly confirmed that no one in her family was happy about Janice's relationship with Turo. Janice's body was transported to the Tarrant County morgue to undergo an autopsy. Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Nizam Pirwani was immediately struck by the condition of the body.
One of the strange things that we discovered at the autopsy was that the body was totally nude, and the story given to us was that she was wearing a blouse and a pair of blue jeans. In 20 years' time, I've never seen a case where the body has been totally disrobed.
And a necklace still clasped around the victim's neck had inexplicably remained intact, though there were numerous other injuries in the same area. Dr. Pirwani also noted the lack of telltale signs usually associated with drowning victims.
In most cases of drowning, one sees purging of frothy fluid, which is usually blood-tinged, and this comes out from the nostrils and the mouth. And it's also present in the trachea and the bronchioles. And this frothy fluid is due to admixing of air and water which is being inhaled in a person who is drowning. We didn't see such frothy fluid anywhere.
That meant there was no water in the victim's lungs. Janice Walters had not died of drowning. As Dr. Pirwani struggled to make sense of his findings, he examined injuries found on the victim's neck. He noticed what appeared to be curvilinear abrasions, injuries typically caused by a victim's fingernails in a struggle to break a stranglehold. None of Janice's injuries were consistent with a drowning death. Dr. Pirwani stopped the examination and contacted Fort Worth police. He wanted to be certain that he had not misunderstood the circumstances surrounding Janice's death. But investigators had no reason to believe that her death was anything but a tragic accident. And the tragedy didn't end with Janice's death alone. As Dr. Pirwani proceeded with the internal examination, he discovered that she was in the early stages of pregnancy. The examination held one last surprise. There were deep hemorrhages of the muscles in the victim's neck. For Dr. Pirwani, there was only one way to explain all of the injuries.
We were not able to show any water in the lung, no frothy fluid, no blood-tinged fluid in the trachea or the bronchial tree. So the negative findings of lungs as well as the positive findings of the neck were consistent with the manual strangulation.
Dr. Pirwani's routine post-mortem examination had uncovered a homicide. After reviewing the autopsy results, Detective Mike Garvin wanted to speak with Janice's boyfriend, Domingo Turo. To overcome any confusion caused by the language barrier, he enlisted a translator for the interview. Turo claimed that recently his relationship with Janice had been rocky. But on the night she died, they had reconciled and were looking forward to starting over. He said he and Janice were returning from dinner shortly after 9 p.m. He started crossing the low-water bridge when a flash flood swept the car into the creek. He struggled to keep the car from being swept downstream. But as the car began to fill with water, he panicked and stated he may have grabbed Janice by the neck to keep her from drowning. But ultimately, the powerful currents tore them apart and she was lost. If Turo had grabbed Janice by the neck, it seemed unlikely that the thin gold chain necklace would have remained intact. Dr. Pirwani's findings, coupled with Turo's statements, led investigators to suspect that he had murdered Janice Walters. But so far, they had no real physical evidence to prove it.
Get the landmarks in.
Investigators in Fort Worth, Texas, believe that the death of 20-year-old Janice Walters was a deliberate act of murder.
Yes, ma'am, we will.
And her boyfriend, Domingo Turo, was the prime suspect. But police had little physical evidence and no motive to make their case. Detective Mike Garvin reviewed statements made by Janice's sister, Kelly Hill. Kelly described Janice as a warm young woman, full of fun, who'd always been very close to her family. She was excited at the prospect of being a mother. But Turo, the father of the unborn child, had become abusive and didn't want the responsibilities that came with having a baby. For the sake of her unborn child, Janice had no choice but to end the relationship with Turo. She moved home to be with her family. But Kelly stated that Turo refused to let her out of his life. A few days before Janice died, Turo called the house and they argued bitterly.
I know you are still thinking.
Kelly stated she listened to the conversation on another extension. Turo threatened to kill Janice if she left him.
You will be sorry if you leave. I am telling.
Convinced that Turo had followed through on his threat, investigators still needed proof. They pored over Turo's statement, looking for any clue they may have overlooked. They found one. Turo said that he and Janice were returning from dinner when they were caught in the flash flood. Looking over maps of the area, detectives realized the couple had been heading in the wrong direction on a dead-end street. Paul Dixon, Assistant District Attorney for Tarrant County, explains the importance of the discovery.
The neighborhood used that dead-end area as sort of an illegal dumping ground. Old mattresses, old tires, trash, that sort of thing. The police had informed us that from time to time, a body would be recovered from that place.
For investigators, it was now clear that Turo was on his way to the dump to dispose of Janice's body. With his story discredited, detectives now had enough evidence to arrest Domingo Turo for the capital murder of Janice Walters. Police believe that when Janice returned to Turo's home to pick up her belongings, his possessiveness, inflamed by Janice's rejection of him, exploded into violence.
You will stay here. No, you will.
After killing her, he removed her clothes and then tried to hide her body, along with any trace of the crime.
He was traveling across the low water bridge, through the rainstorm, through the flood, and nature intervened and kept him from getting to his goal.
Domingo Turo was tried and convicted for the murder of Janice Walters. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison.
Forensic science was very important because without Dr. Pirwani being able to do the autopsy and prove that it was a strangulation, we wouldn't have had a case, even though no matter how much the family thought probably that he had done something foul, we would have had no proof of it at all.
In Texas, forensic science exposed a murderer who tried to submerge evidence of his crime in a flash flood. But in Wisconsin, it took an attentive forensic pathologist to recognize a homicide disguised as an accident. Berlin, Wisconsin, August 22, 1990. A blasting company employee was locking up for the day when he heard someone screaming for help. A man, covered in mud, said he'd just been in a car accident and his ex-wife was unconscious.
Okay, all right.
After calling 911, the two rushed back to the scene. Within minutes, the Green Lake County Sheriff's Department and Berlin emergency medical units arrived. They found a white car in a water-filled ditch, resting against a muddy embankment.
Come on, get one of you guys in here, let's go.
A woman, face down in the ditch, was pulled from the water.
Okay.
Emergency technicians who rushed to her aid discovered that she wasn't breathing. They immediately began critical life-saving procedures, including CPR, to resuscitate her. The efforts paid off. The victim began breathing on her own. Barely clinging to life, she was rushed to the hospital. As the ambulance pulled away, police took a brief statement from the other accident victim. He identified himself as Daniel Egan and the woman as his ex-wife, Darlene. He said she'd swerved suddenly to avoid a deer, and the car plunged into the ditch. Egan told deputies he'd gone for help and returned to find Darlene face down in the water. Darlene was taken to the emergency room at Berlin Memorial Hospital, where doctors fought to save her life. A Green Lake County deputy met Darlene's family at the hospital. As he was explaining details of the accident, a doctor came and told them Darlene had not survived her injuries. The family was devastated by the news, and they couldn't understand why Darlene was with her ex-husband. Sheriff's Deputy Ron Click explains.
When I informed them that Dan Egan was a passenger in the vehicle when it had gone off the roadway, the family indicated to me that because of the rather stormy relationship that they had, that it wasn't likely that she would allow Dan Egan to be in her vehicle.
The deputy contacted investigators at the scene and passed along the information. Wisconsin state troopers began their routine accident reconstruction. By measuring the angle and dimensions of the tire marks left on the road, investigators estimated that the car had been traveling at approximately 49 miles per hour, slightly under the speed limit.
Okay.
But the marks left on the pavement were not the result of braking.
Over there?
They were the result of a deliberate, high-speed turn. According to State Trooper Dennis McConnell, that fact was unusual.
An operator in a vehicle faced with a hazard such as a deer, almost 99% of the time, the first driver reaction to that hazard is to step on the brakes. And there was no indication of braking whatsoever.
The findings were enough for investigators to request that a thorough forensic examination be performed on the vehicle. The car was towed to the police impound lot. The hospital pathologist performed an autopsy on Darlene Egan. From the amount of water in her lungs, the official cause of death was ruled a drowning. But something about the victim's condition was troubling. There was an excessive amount of mud found under her eyes and in her nose and ears. The coroner requested that Darlene Egan's body be re-examined by a forensic pathologist. That evening, evidence technicians began processing the vehicle for clues. They noted the condition of the seatbelt. It was stretched over the steering wheel, still in the buckled position. Technicians also observed a lot of mud plastered on the front of the car. That wasn't unusual, but a closer inspection of the bumper revealed a hair embedded in the mud. Not knowing its significance, the hair was collected and sent to the lab for further analysis. Examiners would later determine that the hair did not belong to Darlene Egan. Investigators interviewed Dan Egan the following day.
Yeah, sure. Why don't you have
They
a seat
wanted a
there?
moment-by-moment account of the accident.
Can I get you a cup of coffee?
Dan said he and Darlene were going to his mother's house to pick up their 2 children when the accident occurred. Egan told police his ex-wife suddenly yelled, "Deer," and swerved hard to the right off the road. The next thing he remembered was the car in the water-filled ditch. Darlene was unresponsive and slumped against the driver's door. Egan said he climbed out of the car and ran to the blasting company for help. He returned to the scene within a few minutes. He couldn't explain how Darlene ended up face down in the ditch. Maybe she'd come to, struggled out of the car, then lost consciousness again. For Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigations agent Rick Lewell, the amount of time necessary for that scenario was at odds with the facts.
We soon realized that there wasn't enough time involved for him to get out of the car, to run and get help, for her to get out of the car, for her to fall in the water and drown before he returned to the scene. So it wasn't passing the smell test. Something stunk here, something was wrong. We had to take a lot deeper look at this entire accident.
For investigators, the circumstances surrounding Darlene Egan's tragic death were raising too many questions. They hoped the forensic pathologist could give them answers. Police in Wisconsin investigating the drowning death of Darlene Egan, killed after the car she and her ex-husband Dan were driving crashed into a ditch, suspected foul play. And Dan Egan's statements to police weren't adding up. To find answers, detectives enlisted a forensic pathologist to conduct a second autopsy. Dr. Robert Huntington III, a forensic pathologist for the state of Wisconsin, was given the assignment.
When we do a forensic autopsy, we've got 3 ends in view. We want to see if we can determine a cause of death. We want to see if we can rule out other causes of death, and we want to see if that body itself can tell us anything about how that death arrived to that body.
The pathologist agreed with the original cause of death, listed as drowning. But the injuries noted during the examination appeared inconsistent with injuries caused by a car crash. They looked like something else.
When we get bodies out of a motor vehicle crash, they are definitely banged up. And she wasn't that banged up. And the really disturbing feature were scratches on and around the face. Now, yes, you can get scratches in a car crash, but some of these had a semblance to fingernail, enough to worry you.
The presence of fingernail scratches found on the victim's head suggested the car crash hadn't caused the drowning. In the final analysis, Dr. Huntington believed that Darlene Egan had been murdered.
Now suppose somebody was holding her head under the water. Now that might explain fingernail marks and such like that.
Dr. Huntington's analysis gave investigators insight into how Darlene Egan died. But to make a murder case against her ex-husband, they now needed to find a motive. They turned to the victim's family for answers. Her sister, Denise Krause, told police that Darlene divorced Dan Egan in 1988 after 5 years of marriage. Dan had become physically abusive, and Darlene lived in constant fear of him. But she was putting her life back together. Darlene had recently taken a job as a state police dispatcher and was a devoted mother to her 2 daughters. She had also become engaged to a police officer. Denise added that Darlene and Dan had been involved in a vicious custody battle up until the day before Darlene's death. As the elements of a motive began falling into place, police contacted Darlene's attorney in the custody dispute.
Yes, I need to talk to you.
She told investigators that Darlene had been granted primary custody of the children. And she confirmed that the ruling came down the day before the accident.
I want to take this opportunity to let you know my recommendation.
In fact, she had met with the couple to discuss the arrangements.
It is my recommendation that Mrs. Egan have full custody of
When told of the court's ruling, Dan became irate. He also resented having to pay child support. He vowed to keep his children no matter what. Armed with this information, investigators went back to question Dan Egan. But this time as the prime suspect in his ex-wife's murder.
Mr. Egan, we need to get some...
Knowing Darlene took great pains to avoid being alone with Dan Egan, investigators wanted to know how the two ended up in Darlene's car together. Dan stated that on the day of the accident, Darlene came by his home to pick up the kids. But Dan's mother had taken the kids that day and was unable to bring them back to his house. And Dan didn't have a car to go get them himself. He admitted that Darlene was upset when she arrived and learned she'd have to pick the children up at his mother's. Darlene and Dan's mother didn't get along, so according to Dan, she asked him to go with her. He claimed that's where they were going when the accident occurred. Before they left, Egan agreed to provide investigators with a hair sample. The hair was sent to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab for analysis. Dan Egan's hair was compared to the hair found on the bumper of Darlene's car. They matched. For investigators, there seemed to be only one explanation for how his hair ended up on the bumper. And that explanation was consistent with the excessive amount of mud noted on the victim's face during autopsy.
Darlene may have pulled hair from her ex-husband while she's fighting to keep from being pushed under the water. And if she did have a handful of his head hair and she's pushed under the car, she would then grab the undercarriage of the car and try and free herself to get out from underneath the water. And in doing so, she would have transferred his head hair to the undercarriage of that car.
As Darlene struggled to save her own life, she left behind proof of murder. Investigators finally had enough evidence to arrest Dan Egan for the murder of his ex-wife. Based on the evidence, police believe that as the couple drove down the road, Dan wrenched the wheel to the right, sending the car into the ditch. Darlene, still buckled into the driver's seat, was ripped from the car. In the struggle, Darlene grabbed Dan by the hair, but he finally overpowered her, forcibly holding her head underwater until she drowned. For the first-degree murder of his ex-wife, Dan Egan was sentenced to life in prison. Once, killers could escape detection by washing away evidence of their crime. But today, advances in forensic science can bring proof of murder to the surface, even when the victims are dead in the water. A quiet town is racked with terror as police hunt a killer who preys on young women. A vague description and inadequate clues are all they have. The next move is up to him. Someone took great pains to try to dispose of a body. Stripped of her identity, this victim can't lead detectives to her killer. Any chance of justice must be found in the dead woman's hands. A dark night, a sharp curve, and a woman lies dead at the bottom of a canyon. It looks like an accident, but maybe that was the plan. Most people don't kill unless they're certain they can get away with it. Murderers always believe they can outwit the police. And that's their fatal error. In the late night hours on Tuesday, November 23, 1982, police in Morris County, New Jersey were visited by the mother and co-worker of 18-year-old Amy Hoffman. Amy had failed to return from her job at a nearby mall. Amy's mother told police that her daughter worked at the dress store 2 nights a week. She was on her high school cheerleading team and was saving to go to college to become a chiropractor. Amy's co-worker said that Amy helped her lock up. It was around 9:30, and they were among the last at the mall. When Amy failed to return home, her mother went to the mall to look for her. Her car was the only one in the lot. Her keys were in the ignition. Amy's book bag, purse, and wallet were all on the seat. But there was no sign of her daughter. Frantic, Mrs. Hoffman called Amy's co-worker. The two didn't know where else to turn. Police responded to the mall parking lot with a canine handler to track Amy. Her scent trail went cold 2 parking spaces away. Evidently, she left the mall with someone else. But who? The parking lot yielded no clues. According to Morris County Detective Sergeant John Kennecom, neither did Amy's car.
We searched the vehicle, as we do routinely, for fingerprints, any type of items which may assist us in the missing person, but we ultimately didn't find anything.
But that was about to change. 2 days later, on Thanksgiving Day, a man out for an afternoon walk in a secluded area of Morris County, New Jersey, made a startling discovery. the lifeless body of a young woman. He fled the scene and called police. Responding deputies from the Morris County Sheriff's Department found the victim lying in an abandoned water retention tank. From the description, police knew they had found Amy Hoffman. She had suffered multiple stab wounds. The body was removed and sent off for further analysis. Investigators began scouring the area for clues, looking for anything that might help them identify Amy's killer. Bloodstains were recovered near the tank, but later tests showed they belonged to the victim. Evidence technicians gathered all that they could. Sometimes the most valuable clues masquerade as ordinary litter. The autopsy had a little more information to offer. The victim had been stabbed repeatedly and had most likely bled to death. There were indications that she'd also been sexually assaulted, but no biological evidence was found. Fibers and bits of foam padding clinging to her boots and clothing were the only potential evidence collected. Hoping for more information, police returned to the mall to question other employees.
I need to ask you some questions.
One woman stated that when she left the mall around 9 p.m., she saw a creepy-looking man just sitting there in his car. She thought the vehicle was an old Chevy. She only caught a glimpse of the man's face. She could not offer police a detailed description. Investigators knew they would have to work quickly.
We knew we had a major offender in our community. We knew we had somebody that was a predator. And what motivated me, as well as all the other law enforcement officers who worked in this case, is we had to capture this guy before he killed again.
But 2 weeks after Amy Hoffman was murdered, a truck driver parked at a rest stop 20 minutes from the Morris County Mall was jolted from his sleep. A terrified young woman was begging for help. She was bleeding badly and barely clinging to life. The truck driver called police. Though she'd lost a lot of blood, 25-year-old Deirdre O'Brien was still conscious when the paramedics came. She told authorities that less than 1 mile from her home, a car forced her off the road. Fearing the driver of the other vehicle had been hurt in the accident, she went to see if he was okay. He brandished a knife and forced her into his car, an old Chevy. He drove her to the rest stop, sexually assaulted her, and then stabbed her repeatedly. Deirdre O'Brien would not survive her injuries. She died at the hospital, but not before giving a description of her killer.
The victim of the second homicide advised law enforcement officers that the assailant was in fact a white male. He was about the same size as the victim, that he had blue jeans on and a certain type of shirt. It was a Western type shirt.
The suspect and his vehicle matched the description of the suspect in the Amy Hoffman case. With only tiny synthetic fibers recovered from Deirdre O'Brien's clothing, investigators went to the site where she had been abducted to search for more clues. they found a tire track left in the dirt. It was photographed, and then a cast was carefully made. To preserve the impression, forensic investigators use a durable casting medium called dental stone, originally formulated for making dental casts. It sets up quickly and is more durable than traditional plaster. While the tread was only one potential clue, it was the strongest.
Most energy was put onto the tire track itself, because we could see where its location, approximately 4 feet from the victim's vehicle, that it was probably the suspect's tire.
The cast and photographs of the tread were sent to forensic tire expert Pete McDonald.
And I looked at the tread design guide book and found that there were maybe 20 different imprints similar. However, the Cyberling Snow Power tire looked the most consistent.
Detective Sergeant Kennecom carried the photo of the tread impression to shopping malls, neighborhoods, and junkyards. But he couldn't find a single tire like the one Pete McDonald described. Investigators were driven to find the killer before the killer found victim number 3.
Where it occurred?
But then a call came in. There'd been another stabbing. Investigators in Morris County, New Jersey struggled to solve the homicides of 2 young women. All of the clues pointed to a serial killer, but none pointed to a suspect. As investigators raced to identify a suspect before he could strike again, another stabbing was reported. This time, the victim was a man, but the details were familiar. 34-year-old James Kodatich told police that while he was driving, he was pulled over by an early model Chevy with a flashing blue light on the dash. The driver of the other car pulled him out of his vehicle and stabbed him. Kodatich fought off his attacker and fled to his mother's house. His description of the assailant resembled the murderer at large. To police, James Kodatich was fortunate. His wounds were not serious. An ambulance came to take him to the hospital. Before leaving, he gave the police permission to examine his car for any trace evidence his attacker might have left. Hoping to find evidence linking this incident to the unsolved murders, examiners thoroughly vacuumed the car. It was an early model Chevy, the same type as described by witnesses of the previous 2 murders. Thinking it may just be a strange coincidence, Detective Kennecom took a closer look at the tires.
I looked at the right rear tire of the vehicle, and it was in fact like the tire we were looking for. I then went to my attaché case where I carried a copy of the sketch of the tire with certain important measurements, measured the tire on the right rear of the vehicle, saw some oddities with that particular tire, and made a match.
James Kodatich's vehicle was now linked to the abduction site of 25-year-old Deirdre O'Brien, murdered a few weeks before. The killer's 3rd victim became the investigation's prime suspect. To be absolutely certain that the tires matched, investigators turned again to forensic tire expert Pete McDonald. The tire in question is rolled on what's essentially a giant ink pad, leaving an impression of its entire tread circumference on a length of white cardboard. After completing this process on Kodatich's Chevy, investigators sent a negative transparency of the tire impression found at Deirdre O'Brien's abduction site to Peter McDonald. McDonald then compared that to the suspect's tire impression. After 25 hours of scrutiny, McDonald was absolutely certain he'd found what he was looking for.
I was able to make a positive identification because there were many cuts and tears in the tire that were unique to that tire only.
That proved that Kodatich's car was at the scene. The information was enough for investigators to obtain a warrant. Kodatich was still in the hospital when arrested for suspicion of murdering Deirdre O'Brien. When confronted with the tire impression evidence, the suspect admitted making a sharp turn on that stretch of highway, but not at the time of the murder. Though police did not believe him, the evidence was only circumstantial. Investigators had to find another way to build their case. And not just for the murder of Deirdre O'Brien, but also for the murder of 18-year-old Amy Hoffman. They wouldn't need to go very far. The fibers collected from Kodatich's car interior were compared against those found on both victims.
Victims' evidence, such as fibers from skirts, were actually found in his car, and then carpet fibers from his vehicle and foam from the seat cushion was actually found on the victims. So there was a cross-link.
Certainly can. No problem.
Despite the evidence against him, Kodatich maintained he was not the killer. He pointed to his stab wound as proof. Investigators decided to take a closer look at the injury. The severity and the angle suggested it was self-inflicted.
How many days ago did you get it?
But why did he bother?
We believe that he thought the police might have had an idea or were looking at him as a suspect in the case, which we weren't, but that's why we believed he made this particular scenario up.
But Kodatich's plan backfired and led investigators right to him. Based on the evidence, police believe that Kodatich prowled for vulnerable women to abduct, molest, and kill. For the murders of Amy Hoffman and Deirdre O'Brien, James Kodatich was sentenced to 95 years. Kodatich was difficult to apprehend because his random victims had no connection to him. Most murders aren't random, and the killer goes to great lengths to obliterate the connection between himself and the victim. On May 8, 1993, a young couple at Lake Lou Yeager Park in Illinois frantically summoned the help of the park caretaker. Someone had built a fire in a pile of brush. In the center was what looked like a mannequin. At first, the couple thought it was a prank, but when they looked closer, they realized whoever did this was deadly serious. The body was real. After the body was pulled from the smoldering pile, the police were notified. Police could discern that the victim was female, but that was all. Her head was missing. They retrieved melted trash bags and a charred cardboard carton from the debris. Detective Mike Sheely of the Illinois State Police led the search for more clues.
We brought in Illinois State Police dogs and attempted to search the area for any other possible evidence and the possibility of finding the victim's decapitated head. Those were unsuccessful.
Investigators had no clue who the killer was, and no clue to the victim either. They felt confident that the identity of the victim would lead to her killer. This crime was simply too gruesome to be a random attack.
Anyone who'd go to all that trouble to try to burn a body and to decapitate them went to a lot of trouble because of the association between the suspect and the victim.
For now, their best clue was the victim herself. X-rays revealed fibroid tumors in her uterus, severe enough to cause medical problems. The plastic bags were ordinary trash bags. The cardboard carton was from a self-service moving company. Neither seemed like much of a clue. A forensic anthropologist was called in to determine all he could from the victim's bones. Determining an approximate age, height, and the victim's race would be crucial to matching her with a missing persons report. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Mark Johnsey of the Illinois State Police Crime Lab made the analysis.
The pubic symphysis, which is down the pelvic region, is a very good indicator of age. The pelvic bone in this area changes very diagnostically with age, and based on that I could make an assessment of her age, which I gave her an age range of 35 to 39.
Establishing race was more problematic. Flesh tone is distorted in death, and the fire didn't help that. Dr. Johnsey had to rely on his best judgment under difficult circumstances.
Both the pubic hair and the axillary hair in the armpit, which she had both, was very straight. And she was fairly light-skinned, and with a combination of those features, it was just felt that she was a Caucasian.
Now, investigators needed a name. The most certain way of identifying a person is by fingerprints. But that works only if they can be lifted from the victim and if the victim's prints are on file somewhere. Illinois State Police forensic scientist Gary Havey was assigned the task of seeing that this Jane Doe met those requirements. The victim's hands were removed and sent in sealed cans to his lab. They were dry and stiffened in a clutched position. If Havey hoped to raise any prints, he'd have to amputate individual fingers and soften the tissue.
In the case of Jane Doe, in order to soften the tissue, one of the procedures or methods that I have found to be useful over the last years is to actually soak the fingers in a solution of detergent.
The solution softens the tissue on the friction ridges, which are the unique arches, whorls, and loops on every person's fingertips. Once the fingers were softened and dried, Havey rolled them in ink and printed their ridge patterns onto white paper. But he wasn't satisfied.
I didn't want just suitable prints, I wanted the absolute best standard we could achieve. We then decided to utilize a different method in obtaining the friction ridge detail from the fingers and palms. Over the years, I've had good success utilizing black powder and frosted lifting tape.
The powder and tape yielded better results, which were then photographed and labeled. They would then be classified and sent to AFIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System in Joliet, Illinois, which holds fingerprint cards for the entire state. Only Jane Doe's left thumb and index fingers were clear enough for the APHIS computer. Usually, that's all it needs.
At this time, there were 1.7 to 1.8 million cards on file in Joliet. It would be totally impossible for me to manually search all of those cards, but with APHIS, we can actually scan those individual cards in a period of 30 minutes upwards to 2 or 3 hours.
The results came back negative. No matches. The victim and her killer remained anonymous. A nameless murder victim was found burning in an Illinois park. Until investigators could determine the identity of the Caucasian woman, her killer would remain free. Desperate for clues, detectives interviewed witnesses who were in the park the night the body was discovered. 2 students, taking a drive after their prom, reported seeing the fire. Nearby was a cargo van. They believed the tags were from Missouri. The back was open and they could see plastic trash bags. Detectives were convinced the teenagers next saw the killer.
They actually pull alongside the suspect van, and they're quite alarmed that somebody would actually have a fire in this no-burn area. They're familiar with the park, and basically at that point, the suspect sees the car pull alongside, and he immediately runs and jumps into the van and speeds away.
But without a tag number, it was another untraceable lead. To solve this case, investigators had to identify the victim, who they referred to as Janie Doe. They expanded the APHIS fingerprint search.
We performed APHIS searches in over 45 different APHIS systems throughout the United States, Canada, and even Puerto Rico. This would prove to be the most extensive APHIS search ever undertaken by the Illinois State Police.
Millions of prints were scrutinized, and still no leads. The victim apparently had no criminal record and was not on any database. Likewise, hundreds of missing persons reports were scrutinized over a period of more than 18 months. Though none matched the description of a 30-something Caucasian woman whose fingerprints matched Janie Doe's, one name consistently popped up.
The one constant factor that we continued to see was a victim, Lynn Matcham Thomas, from the greater St. Louis area. She had came on our list before, and we had called St. Louis missing persons and also talked to the homicide squad, but we had discounted the fact that this would be our victim because she was African American.
With no other leads, investigators went to speak with Shirley Matcham, the mother of Lynn Matcham Thomas. Like her daughter, she lived in Missouri, only 50 miles from the Illinois park where the victim was found. Shirley had reported Lynn missing the day before the body was found. According to her mother, Lynn had light skin. Like the victim, she also had fibroid tumors that she was seeing a doctor about. In fact, the day she disappeared, her brother had dropped her off at her doctor's office and made arrangements to pick her up afterward. When he returned, he was 10 minutes late. He went inside, but she was no longer there. He assumed that she grew tired of waiting and decided to walk home. He didn't think anything more about it. Later that night, Mrs. Matcham received a call from Lynn's husband, Curtis Thomas, asking where Lynn might be. He said she'd left his house 20 minutes earlier, and he assumed she'd gone to her mother's. But her mother hadn't seen her all day. Shirley Matcham knew her son-in-law to be violent and suspected the worst. The next day, she filed a missing persons report with the St. Louis Police Department. Investigators reviewed the report. They learned that St. Louis police had followed up with a visit to Lynn's home to speak with her husband, Curtis Thomas. He told them that the night Lynn disappeared, she was moving out of the house. He wasn't happy about it, and they fought. The last time he'd seen her, she was walking away from the house. At first, he thought she'd just run off without her things, but when she didn't show up at her mother's, he thought something serious might have happened. Sifting through the report, investigators found another potential clue.
We also found out that when Lynn Matcham Thomas was discovered missing, that the police had went to the Thomas residence and asked for permission to search the house. Mr. Thomas let him in. They conducted a search on the second and first floors, and when the police asked to go to the basement, Mr. Thomas insisted that he call his attorney, and they terminated the search.
With no victim or any signs of foul play, the missing persons investigation in St. Louis ended. But now, almost 2 years later, investigators in Illinois suspected that the body found in the park was Lynn Matcham Thomas. The timing of her disappearance fit. Her medical condition was the same. And her husband, Curtis Thomas, was becoming the prime suspect. Investigators in Illinois struggled to identify a decapitated woman found burning in a state park. Though they believed she was Shirley Matcham Thomas and that her husband Curtis had put her there, they had to prove it. Investigators went back to Lynn's mother for past employment information about her daughter.
And quite to our surprise, she said that her daughter had been employed by a local bank, and during the course of that employment that she had been fingerprinted. So we were able to go to the St. Louis Police Department now and look in a specific file. Those files were not in any database, and manually had to pull those fingerprints to compare them with our Janie Doe.
The comparison was made. Janie Doe was, in fact, Lynn Matcham Thomas. Because of their stormy marriage, their violent history, and the fact that he was the last one to have seen Lynn, Curtis Thomas became the prime suspect. What police needed was proof. Investigators now tried to find a link between evidence left at the crime scene and the suspect. They determined that a cardboard carton pulled from the fire was from the same moving company that the victim was using to pack her belongings. However incriminating, the evidence was only circumstantial. To learn more about Curtis Thomas and his activities following Lynn's disappearance, investigators located an ex-girlfriend who he started seeing after his wife was reported missing. She said that Curtis claimed the police were stupid for misidentifying the race of Janie Doe. This was several weeks before she was identified as African American. She also added that Curtis had access to a van through his work. It matched the description of the van seen at the park the night of the murder. The girlfriend was frightened of Curtis and ended the relationship. That testimony, along with the rest of the circumstantial evidence they gathered, gave investigators enough to arrest Curtis Thomas in January 1995 for suspicion of murdering his wife almost 2 years earlier. A search warrant for his home was issued. Though Thomas insisted he knew nothing about the fate of his estranged wife, investigators found newspaper clippings regarding the mysterious body in Illinois. Police theorized that the abusive Curtis Thomas was unwilling to let his wife simply walk out on him. Investigators believe that after murdering Lynn Matcham Thomas, he kept the body in the basement until he could get the work van. And to throw investigators off his trail, he beheaded the victim, then transported her to the park in Illinois, where he set the remains on fire. Curtis Thomas was found guilty. He was sentenced to life without parole. Thomas tried to erase the connection between himself and the victim. Others try to erase all evidence of the crime itself. On September 14, 1985, a motorist on a secluded highway in Utah pulled over to help a frantic man. David Mosman said his pickup truck went off the road in Logan Canyon and plunged 285 feet to the river below. His wife, Tanya, was still down there. The motorist called for help. Though banged up and visibly shaken, Mosman's injuries were relatively minor. He told emergency workers that his wife was conscious when he'd helped her out of the wreck and onto the shore. He begged them to help her. As David Mosman was transported to the hospital, a rescue team was in the canyon, searching in the dark for his wife. About 40 feet from the overturned vehicle, caught on rocks in the middle of the river, lay Tanya Mosman. She was face down in the water, dead. By the time she was retrieved, David Mosman was in the hospital getting his wounds treated. He told the nurse that he glanced off the road for a second to look at his wife. At that instant, the truck went over. He blamed his carelessness for the accident. Investigators arrived at the hospital. They asked the nurse if David was in any shape to make a statement. She told them that his injuries were minor and he needn't stay there. She said that Mosman told her he'd been thrown from the truck just as it went over the embankment. She considered him lucky to be alive. Investigators waited until the next day to get a detailed account of the accident. When asked about his marriage, David Mosman said that things between him and his wife had been shaky. They were going through a bitter divorce, but lately they were working to save their relationship. That night, he'd taken her to a restaurant. They enjoyed themselves and each other. It was like it used to be before their relationship soured. After dinner, they'd headed home. David Mosman had driven that stretch of road dozens of times before. He said he must have taken his eyes off the road as he approached the curve. He said all he remembered was his wife's screams. Confused and shaken, he made his way to the bottom of the canyon. When he reached Tanya, she was partially ejected from the back of the truck. He helped her out and started back up to get help. Utah Highway Patrol Officer Larry Forsgren worked the accident investigation.
He said he put her on the bank and that she was all right, and he had talked to her and she was fine. He said that she did mention that her head hurt a little bit, but other than that, and he didn't see any blood, she wasn't bleeding, and he put her on the bank so then he'd go up and get help.
Mosman said it took him more than 2 hours to climb up the canyon in the dark. He thought he must have blacked out or fallen asleep in the cold. He didn't know how his wife ended up back in the river. In the days following Tanya Mosman's death, accident reconstruction experts studied the spot where the truck went over. On the pavement was a small scuff mark, showing that the steering wheel was turned abruptly off the road at about 20 to 30 miles per hour. For Cache County Deputy Medical Examiner Sergeant George Becker, that fact presented an inconsistency with David Mosman's account.
At that point, the vehicle would tilt up to go off the road as it's going over the bank. It would have been impossible to get out of the vehicle on the driver's side. You'd have to lift the door straight up and climb out while the vehicle is moving. It's impossible.
The routine analysis of the accident had raised more questions than it answered. For investigators, this case demanded a closer look. Police in Utah continued investigating the tragic death of Tanya Mosman, killed when the truck she and her husband David were driving plunged 285 feet into a canyon. David Mosman's account of the accident didn't jibe with the facts. Investigators requested an autopsy on Tanya Mosman. Water in her lungs showed that her cause of death was drowning. A mark from hip to shoulder suggested she'd been wearing her seatbelt, which would have made it impossible for her to be thrown through the back windshield, as her husband claimed. The only other marks to her body were 3 blunt and distinctive contusions on the back of her head. Looking for answers, the forensics team inspected the truck for what might have caused the marks. They also used chemically treated swabs called hemosticks, which turn blue on contact with traces of blood. No blood was found, and no object in the truck could have caused the victim's contusions. Investigators went back to the scene to gather more information. What they found was a length of sprinkler irrigation pipe entangled on the riverbank. David Mosman, a school teacher, moonlighted as a sprinkler installer. The pipe was sent to Dr. Kent Glanville of the Logan County Police Department Crime Lab for further examination. He placed the pipe over life-sized photographs of the wounds on Tanya's head. The pipe was a perfect fit. But Mosman had a reason to carry it And, however unlikely, it might have struck the victim during the truck's tumble. With all the inconsistencies and lingering questions, investigators pressed Mosman to try to remember more details of the accident. He was asked to draw a map of the road and to mark where he lost control and went over. He did it with pinpoint accuracy, something most accident victims can't do.
He was exactly sure that this is where he went off, and it was close to the approximate same area that the vehicle went off. And that was kind of odd because when he went off, it was nighttime, it was dark. And for him to pinpoint it, he had to be pretty familiar with that location. And I got the impression that he knew beforehand where that vehicle was going to go off.
Things that I just don't think anything about.
2 days after the accident, that impression was reinforced when a friend of David Mosman's named Terry contacted police. He said the couple had a difficult marriage and that David was always joking about how he was going to kill Tanya. Chief Prosecutor Jim Jenkins followed the investigation.
David told Terry that he didn't want to go through the expense of a divorce. He didn't want to risk losing custody of the two children. And he didn't want to give any of the property or finances that he had accumulated.
Now trying to prove that David Mosman had murdered his wife, police began interviewing Tanya's friends. They were well aware of the Mosmans' disintegrating marriage. One friend said that Tanya was often terrified of David. Sometimes he was violent. Mostly they fought over the custody of their two young children. She told investigators that David had recently tried to make Tanya sign a document he'd written, forcing her to relinquish custody of their kids if they divorced. He'd even threatened to kill her if she didn't sign it. Even so, Tanya sought legal advice about getting a divorce. Shortly after that, David began acting very nicely to her. Tanya told her friend that she was looking forward to dinner with her husband. She sincerely believed that on the night she died, they would reconcile. It all seemed tragically convenient for David Mosman, so investigators continued to dig. They discovered that David had had a $10,000 life insurance policy on his wife for many years. But 9 months before her death, while their marriage was crumbling, he took out additional policies for an additional $100,000. A motive was firmly established, and the circumstances of Tanya's death were suspicious. Still, it could have been an improbable accident. Investigators had to prove that it wasn't. David Mosman said he left his injured wife on the riverbank, but she was found in the middle of the river. Investigators hired hydrological engineer Dr. Dave Tullis to see if that was possible.
The deputy wanted me to assess the situation and see if there was any reasonable way that she could have gone from the riverbank, where he said he left her, to the location in the river in the condition that she was in.
Dr. Tullis measured the river's depth, velocity, and direction of the current to calculate if an object as large as a human body could be carried from the bank and deposited at the spot where the victim was found. He determined that the shallow water near the bank couldn't support a body, and even if it could, the speed and direction of the current would carry it along the edge, not to the middle of the river.
If she was unconscious, she couldn't move, and the current would not have been able to move her along, and so she would have been found right by the riverbank in the unconscious condition or drowned condition.
But she wasn't. She had never been taken to the bank of the river, as her husband had said. David Mosman was arrested for suspicion of murdering his wife. Investigators believe that David Mosman tried to kill Tanya in the premeditated crash. But when she survived, he had to climb down the canyon and finish the job. The motive, apparently, was hatred of his wife, custody of his children, and $110,000 in insurance. For his crimes, David Mosman was sentenced to life in prison. Prisons are filled with people who thought they'd committed the perfect crime. But a murder isn't over once the victim is dead. For investigators, that's just the beginning. They turn to forensic scientists to help bring justice to the victims by exposing a killer's fatal error.